Chapters 22 through 24. "Steady on," said a voice as Jack launched his attack with flailing arms. "Stop! I need to talk to you." As soon as he started, Jack realized he didn't have the strength to continue. His legs wobbled and spots danced around the edges of his vision. He glanced at Beth, who hadn't moved from where she stood. Why didn't she help him? Backing away from the figure standing in the doorway, bald fist at his sides, he found the edge of the trolley bed and sat with a thump. A man stood gazing at him, pale lips parted in a smile, his pointy yellow teeth clearly visible. Jack recognized him instantly from the photo in the newspaper. Richard Blackstone's face was ingrained in his memory. He was obviously older, with lines etched across his temples and saggy, molted skin under his chin. And instead of a suit, he wore gray jogging pants and a white lab coat. "Sorry, we had to be so heavy-handed with you," Blackstone gestured to the door, "but I couldn't risk you running off again, especially since you're injured." He came and stood next to the bed and moved his toad-like face inches away from Jack's. He could see the hair sprouting from the man's nostrils. "First things first, let's take a look at you." Blackstone made to move the hair where Jack had hurt himself. Jack flinched. "I'm not going to hurt you. You've had a nasty fall, and I need to examine you." "To check I'm well enough for your experiments," Jack said, his voice rasping with pain and fear. Blackstone looked at him. "You need to be checked over. The ambulance will be here soon." Jack snorted. What kind of game was Blackstone playing? As if he'd get in an ambulance and allow him to leave. "Don't touch me." "Perhaps you'd answer some questions then." Jack glared at him. "How many fingers am I holding up?" Jack pointedly turned away. "How old are you?" Jack was silent. Blackstone would have to prise the information out of him. "I'm trying to help you. I don't like being disturbed to attend to a teenager who's been caught trespassing. It's time to stop playing games. Now, what's your name?" Blackstone pulled up a seat next to him. "Well, perhaps if I start things off, it will prompt your memory. You're Tom's son. My PR manager briefed me on your visit today. She also told me you're looking for your dad. The question is, why would you think he's here?" Beth piped up at this point. "We know he used to work here. His dad is the only one who can help him with a skin allergy. We thought we might find a clue as to where he is." Blackstone regarded her with his tiny black eyes. "I haven't seen Tom Phillips since he left 14 years ago." "We know all about your experiments on children," said Jack, unable to keep quiet any longer, "and on your dog." "What are you talking about?" "Don't deny it. It's in the newspapers. We've spoken to Ted Harris and seen the rats in your lab." "Let me assure you, we have never carried out experiments on children," said Blackstone. "Those articles you read were based on rumors put out there by a disgruntled cleaner we sacked." Jack sank back on the bed, resting on the thin pillow. His mind was buzzing, a mass of confused thoughts crashing together. Blackstone was lying. He had to be. "Paramedics are here," a gruff voice said from the doorway. Chapter 23. Jack was vaguely aware of voices, whispers, and slamming doors. He opened his eyes and found himself staring up at a white paneled ceiling. He must have dozed off. Confused, for one terrifying moment, he thought he was back at the lab. Then he remembered he'd been taken in an ambulance. The metal bed he lay on was in the hospital. One of those pulse monitor pegs was clipped to his finger, with a beeping machine set up next to him, and the bed was surrounded by a flowery curtain. He'd been in the hospital all day under observation. Standard procedure for a bang on the head, the doctor said. Everything that had happened over the last 24 hours came flooding back to him, and he groaned. Dr. Blackstone had ended up following the ambulance in his car, and after the doctors had finished their examination, he'd sat with Jack and Beth, answering their questions until Auntie Lil arrived. Jack cringed as the memories of that conversation crowded in on him. Ted Harris was fired for incompetence, not disposing of equipment and used supplies in a safe manner, said Dr. Blackstone. I'm afraid his resentment boiled over, and he went to the papers with a load of made-up stories, saying he'd witnessed things he hadn't seen. As he cleaned in the labs, he'd noticed the rats your dad used in his experiments. He saw their blisters, and, of course, he knew, as everyone did, about Tom and Maeve's child with the strange skin condition. Put the two together, and what do you get? Over time, Ted even began to believe his own lies. Jack stared fixedly at the numbers on the monitor beside the bed. The figure slowly climbed as his pulse started to race. Blackstone made it all sound so plausible. Not much is needed to start rumors flying in a small community like this. As the chief scientist on the anti-aging project, the press targeted your dad. The media is always trying to discredit the work we do here, and people are ready to believe what they say where experimentation is concerned. Your dad left because he couldn't stand the allegations circling about him, even though none of it was true. It wasn't a pleasant time for him. He hated all the attention and negative comments he attracted when he walked along the street, and he didn't want the rumors to damage the company. Not that I cared about that. I knew the press would quickly lose interest, especially after the short-lived police investigation, but poor Tom couldn't take the pressure. He's a brilliant scientist, but an extremely sensitive man. We were all devastated when he left. You didn't defend him, though, did you? The papers don't say anything about you standing up for him. Puh! The papers will write what they want and leave out anything that doesn't suit their story. They'll do whatever it takes to sell their newspapers. If the front read Blackstone backs renowned scientist, would people have taken any notice of it? I doubt it. I tried to persuade your father to change his mind about leaving, but with no success, I'm afraid. My aunt says he had trouble getting another research job afterwards because of the rumors. Unlikely. Research companies are well used to this type of situation, and with his reputation, he shouldn't have had any problems. However, the experience could have hurt him in other ways. Sometimes it's not outside factors that affect whether a person gets a job, it's what's happening inside them, their state of mind. What do you mean? Like I said, your dad's sensitive. He took things to heart and couldn't let them go. He lost confidence. It's easy to do in this industry. I remember your dad as a perfectionist, a passionate scientist. Sometimes passion can get in the way of rational thought. Are you saying my dad went mad? No, I'm saying he was probably suffering from stress. Beth, who had been quiet all this time, gave a tiny gasp and shifted in her seat. Can stress cause physical symptoms too? She asked. Blackstone smiled. Ah, budding scientist, I see. It's believed that stress can affect the body in many different ways. Puzzled, Jack glanced at her, wondering what she was getting at, but he had his own questions to ask. What about my skin? You said Ted made the stories up, but I've got the same symptoms as the rat and Rex. Similar symptoms, not the same. That's the key. In medicine, the little differences are important. For a start, you don't look as if you've had a problem with hair loss. The fact you suffer from a skin complaint is nothing to do with being given drugs from here. The rats you saw in my laboratory had side effects to the anti-aging drugs I gave them. That much is true. We isolated them from the healthy rats, which we keep in a separate guarded area. Unfortunately, the sick rats haven't responded to the treatment, so we've decided to put them to sleep. When your dad left the company, he left behind all his research. I've tried to continue what he started, but I'm nowhere near as brilliant as him. And we lost some of the funding for the project, so I've been using my own money, my own laboratory, and my own time. He paused a second while he took his glasses off and wiped the lenses with a handkerchief from his pocket. And what do you know about my dog? The bus we were on ran it over, Beth said quietly. When we got out to take a look, we found sores all over its body. Blackstone took a sharp intake of breath and dabbed his brow with the handkerchief before folding it neatly and putting it back in his pocket. Rex escaped 4 weeks ago. I use a flat at the laboratories in case I need to work at night, as I sometimes do. I thought he'd been stolen. He was probably suffering from mange, from running wild. That condition causes sores and scabs and can lead to hair loss. And your spies? Jack whispered. Ted told us about them. Spies? Why would I have spies? Another of Ted's fantasies, I think. But Mrs. Roberts, Jack faltered. He was beginning to realize he'd made a colossal mistake. Everything he and Beth had investigated and found out over the last couple of days was based on a fragile web of lies and rumors. Rumors he'd been ready to believe. How could he have been so stupid? How could he have gotten so carried away? There had been no experimentation on children. Nobody had been watching him. He hadn't seen Mrs. Roberts in town. He had just imagined he had. Ted wasn't the only one with an overactive imagination. I thought I was being spied on by my neighbor. What? Beth gaped at him. You didn't tell me that. Mrs. Roberts has always been odd with me, and then when we were in town, she was there lurking. I was sure it was her. If she was there, it had nothing to do with me. Blackstone stood up, stretching his spine as he did so. I need to get back. I've got a long day in front of me, and I'm not as young as I once was. He placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. Things will be clearer when you've rested. Sometimes the answers to our problems are closer than we think. Alone now, Jack gingerly moved the blankets back. Embarrassingly, someone had taken his trousers off, and he was in his boxer shorts. He looked at the new bandage on his leg, excuse me, and slowly started undoing the dressing. Cautiously, he lifted off the gauze pad and inspected his shin. Pus oozed out of the long slit and had stained the pad yellow. He shuddered as he replaced the bandage. It made him feel sick looking at it. What an idiot he was for getting so carried away with his theory about Dad, and he felt a deep shame. How could he have believed Dad was involved in something so wrong? And how had he got so sidetracked? He'd wasted precious time he didn't have. His skin was not going to get better on its own. His leg throbbed as if in agreement. He still had to find Dad, and there was only one person who could help him do that. There was a click of heels on the floor, and a curtain swished open as Mom appeared. Relief washed over him, and he beamed as she gave him a hug. Thank goodness you're all right. I've been worried sick since Auntie Lil called me. I came as soon as I could. I brought you some magazines and your iPod from Lil's. By the way, she slapped them on the bedside table and plunked herself in a chair by his bed. Jack knew he was in for a lecture. What on earth possessed you? First, going off without telling me, then climbing onto the lab roof. You're lucky Dr. Blackstone's so understanding and is not going to press charges. Very lucky, in fact. Sorry, he mumbled. I wanted to find Dad. I didn't realize how badly you wanted to see him. I should have listened to you properly, taken more notice. And why didn't you talk to me about your skin? Not left it to Lil to tell me. You seem so worried about money and everything, and I've been a bit preoccupied lately. But you can always talk to me, whatever's on your mind, and things will be different from now on. Your dad's got in touch again, and he'll be coming to see you when we get home. You found him? Mom reached out and ruffled his hair. He was never really lost. He just didn't think how his actions would affect you. Jack grinned with delight. And I found a great skin specialist, and she wants to meet you, continued Mom. We'll get on top of this, you'll see. I've had enough of being prodded and poked by doctors. Fat lot of good it's done. All he needed was a stronger sun lotion. Didn't she get that? Dad can help me. Mom peered at him and sighed. He can certainly start acting like a proper dad. She squeezed his hand and stood up. Listen, Jack, I thought you realized how bad things were between your dad and me. What with all the arguing? I didn't think it was that serious, he mumbled. I owe you a decent explanation about everything when you get out of here. But there's something outside. There's someone outside who's very eager to see you. I'll grab a coffee and send her in. Mom disappeared through the curtain. Grunting, Jack stretched out a hand towards the magazines. Unable to reach, he clambered out of bed, unclipping the pulse monitor. Immediately, the machine gave an angry beep. Ignoring it, he shuffled over to the chair and picked up the top magazine, Street Sport. Funny Mom had chosen that one for him when she didn't have a clue what he did on the roofs. He was about to hop back into bed when his attention was caught by the front cover of the magazine. Underneath, Mom must have picked it up from Auntie Lil's by mistake. Factors affecting photosensitivity, read the headline of Best Junior Medical Monthly. Climbing back into bed and reclipping the pulse monitor before a nurse could appear to tell him off, he thumbed through the magazine until he found the article. He stared at the words so long and hard they started to blur in front of his eyes. His brain refused to take in what he was reading. At last he sank back on the pillows, the magazine falling with a thud to the floor. Chapter 24. The word psychosomatic bounced around inside his head like a silver ball in a pinball machine. He picked the magazine up again and tried to focus on what the article said. That some physical conditions and diseases could be made worse by mental factors, such as stress and anxiety. There was that word again, stress. Could that be him? When exactly had the first sore appeared? It'd been before Dad had gone away, hadn't it? He searched the deepest niches of his brain, and then he remembered. His symptoms had started on his birthday, a few months after Dad left, when Dad had sent a short email, an email that hadn't even said happy birthday. And it was then that the first seeds of doubt about whether he was ever coming back had been sown. After that, the sores kept popping up, each one worse than the last. Then there'd been the wound on his leg and the sore behind his ear, and of course, his leg. He cast his mind back to when he'd found that sore. It was after the visit to the library, when Mom had told him about the separation and seeing the solicitor. Words from the magazine article trickled through his head. Had worrying about Dad made his photosensitivity worse? Was it possible for anxiety to have such an impact on his skin? He thought back to what Dr. Blackstone had said. Sometimes the answers to our problems are closer than we think. Perhaps stress was to blame, and all the investigations he and Beth had done would have piled on more stress. He swallowed the lump that had appeared in his throat. Did he need a stronger lotion, or was his dilapidated skin a result of his mind playing tricks on his body? He didn't know what to believe anymore. A head appeared between the two curtains, and Beth sidled into the cubicle, rucksack in her hand. He gave her a watery grin, glad to see her friendly face. Hi, she said. Hi yourself. Beth's hair was a mess, flattened to her scalp and drooping over the left side of her face. Gray streaks marked her cheeks, and dirty shadows surrounded each eye. Exhaustion was stamped on her features. She looked as bad as he felt. How's things? He asked. I'm in trouble with Kathy. Nothing I can't handle, though, she said, as she sat on the edge of his bed, her knees touching his thigh. Feeling any better? Jack shrugged. He attempted another smile and then grimaced as a sharp pain scooted across his bashed forehead. Not bad. See, you've got your rucksack back. Dr. Blackstone gave it to me, she said, twisting her fingers through the straps. Unease seemed to Unease seemed to ooze out of her, and an awkward silence stretched between them. So you'll be able to leave soon, your mom says. At least you can stop looking for your dad. Yeah, he said. I feel a bit of an idiot now, getting obsessed with it all. Her eyes flitted to the magazine lying on the bed and back to Jack. You found the article then, she said quickly. Does it make sense? This? He said, confused. Then the cogs in his brain creaked into action as he looked from the magazine in his hand to Beth. A vague memory stirred of her reading Junior Medical Monthly at Auntie Lil's. At the time, she'd been cagey about it, and he'd wondered why. Wait a minute. You know about this psychosemantic disorder? She gave him a long look, a tinge of pink coloring each gray cheek. Then she nodded, lips pressed together. In a thin line, when I first met you on the roofs, I remembered reading about it in my magazine. Why didn't you show it to me? An icy tickle scuttled down his spine as he stared at Beth's gray white face and grappled with the idea that she'd known about the article all along. I told you worry might be making your skin worse. I'm sure I did. Her voice faltered. Suddenly she looked unsure of herself. Before we went to the lab last night, you didn't want to know. Jack's skull buzzed unpleasantly. He'd been too caught up in his plan to get into the labs to take much notice of what she was saying. Maybe she had told him, but it was little too late. Hurt throbbed in the veins under his fragile skin. She pushed him to investigate Dad's disappearance, egged him on. She suggested they visit Auntie Lil, talk to Ted, meet Blackstone. Why do that if she thought it would make him worse? He felt giddy as if all the air had been sucked out of his lungs by a huge vacuum pump. You should have told me before things went so far. The features on her face seemed to collapse in on themselves. When you suggested getting into the lab, I said it was a bad idea. I tried to stop you. You didn't try very hard, did you? I didn't know things would get that bad. I thought there might be a link between your dad leaving and your skin, but I wasn't sure. It's not something I could prove. Jack suddenly realized why she had quizzed Dr. Blackstone about stress. Not because of Dad, but because of his skin. You seemed so sure you needed a new lotion, and I didn't think for a minute everything would turn out the way it did. I'm sorry. You should have shown me the article, he repeated. She paused a beat. Like you should have told me about the ashes. Oh, I get it. So this is some kind of payback. No, it's not, Jack. I'm not like that. Jack's embarrassment and upset spilled out of him. What an idiot he'd been to believe he'd found someone who really got him. You know what I think? You've been trying to forget your own problems by focusing on mine. He knew he was going too far, but somehow he couldn't stop himself. Beth gazed at her hands in her lap. I wanted to help you. Stop interfering in my life and sort your own out. You need to face facts. Your parents are dead, and nothing will bring them back. As soon as those furious words left his mouth, a fistful of guilt and sadness punched his anger away. Sorry formed on his lips, but it was too late. Her face was frozen and closed. Not meeting his eyes, she grabbed her bag and stuffed the magazine inside. He stretched out a hand to hold her back, but she darted out of reach. He turned away, his eyes prickling with unshed tears, and as he listened to the curtain swishing open, he stifled a moan. He didn't understand what had been going on. Had she used him as a distraction? If so, could he really blame her? She was damaged, like him. He had to take some responsibility for his actions because not everything was her fault.